Yes, it is. Hey, you all, Farmer Jesse here. Got another great video for you from Jennie Love in Philadelphia at Love and Fresh Flowers. This one is all about no-till tulips. Tulips are a very labor-intensive crop. So Jennie has a much better method that is more soil-friendly and more farmer-friendly. Real quick, this video is supported in part by a grant from Southern SARE. So let's do it.
So on a frosty November morning, here we are. We're about to put in the tulips for this season that'll bloom next spring. So I wanted to introduce you guys to my no-till tulip concept and how we plant tulips here at Love and Fresh Flowers. I get those two confused. At Love and Fresh Flowers, how we do it so that we don't disturb the soil in any way. There's a lot of benefits to this technique, and so I thought it would be really great to share it with you all so you can be inspired to do it at your farm. So the first steps we're doing right now are to have a bed prepared. So this was a bed that had been in zinnias prior to this very frosty frost that we have at the moment. The bed was cleared. The zinnias were cut down to the ground, but the roots are still in the ground because we wanted to leave the roots there for the microbiology to chew on all winter long. We broad forked the bed just to aerate it like we would anytime we flip a bed, we broad fork. That's just what we do here at my farm. And then now what's the next step is going to be to put some boards in place. We make temporary raised beds where we take boards. These are decking boards, so they are 6 feet tall when put up and you can get them in 8, 10, or 12 foot lengths at the hardware store. We use decking boards because they're cheaper, and they also are meant to last longer in outdoor conditions, so you can invest in them one time and then be able to use them over and over again from season to season. So it might seem like a fairly large amount of money to spend initially, but if you're going to use them for 10, 20 years, which should be completely feasible, then it's really not much at all. So you get decking boards for the entire length that you want to make your bed. So we're going to have decking board on that side and on this side, as you'll see as my crew puts that together. We use rebar stakes to set the boards up on end like this. And then that way the beds are really just temporary. We don't want to use raised beds at my farm. There's nothing wrong with raised beds, but for my farm setup, it doesn't really work. It would create a hiccup in the efficiency of the way my farm flows to have these boards in place all times. So we just want it to be here so that we can put the tulips in place, cover them with compost. We'll show you this whole process then. And then in the spring, when the tulips bloom, we're going to deconstruct the boards. We'll take the boards off, and then we'll have this gorgeous compost that we're able to use throughout the farm to set up our beds for crops next season. So that's kind of the process, but we'll walk you through it as we go along today. Okay, so once you are getting ready to set up your no-till tulip structure with the temporary raised beds, you might be kind of considering cost effectiveness of the various things that you could use for these temporary sides to the bed. I've chosen to use the decking boards, but I also know people that use fallen logs out of their woodlot or so forth, so you don't have to invest so much money into the initial setup if you're still getting started with tulips and you're not really sure if this is something you're going to do year after year. Here at Love and Fresh Flowers, we actually are growing about 10,000 tulips a year, and I do that year after year, so it's worth investing in a good setup that I can use again and again. So with that, we use the decking boards, and we also use rebar stakes, generally speaking, because this is something we can use. It's easy to store. It'll last indefinitely. But if you're struggling to, come up with capital and cash flow at the moment, you can also use old tomato stakes. So if you've been staking your dahlias or other things around your farm or your tomatoes, you always end up with some tomato stakes that aren't that good of quality after a while. So you can cut them up, put a point on the end, and then you can use those to pound into the ground as well. But you're basically going to pound in your stakes to hold up the boards. You want to I generally actually just put 2 stakes, one on either side, in the middle of the board. Just one, this is one board here, there's a set here, there's one board down there, there's a set there. That's all you need. You just need something to generally hold up the boards until you get compost in place. Once the compost is in the bed, you won't really need much support for the boards at all. This just helps keep them upright for the time being. So you'll see here in the bed at the bottom, we currently have irrigation tape, and so you can put irrigation on the bottom of your bed before you build it if you want, or you can just hand water your tulips. But tulips do need water at the beginning of their life cycle and then also at the stage of blooming. One of the things that is very challenging in this system for a lot of people is getting enough water to the bulbs of the tulips. So a lot of people tend to water their tulip beds from the top, and that is a really long process to get water all the way down to the tulip bulbs, because the tulip bulbs are going to be down here on the ground. But once we get the compost in, you know, the bed's quite high, so that's a lot of inches for water to filter down through if we were watering from the surface. So if you put irrigation down at the bottom of your bed, then the water goes straight and immediately to the tulip roots. So that's one thing to consider if you want. You don't have to do it, but if you've already got drip irrigation down on your bed from your summer crops, it's really easy to just leave it in place. Make sure there's no leaks in it, of course, because you don't want to have a lot of flooding water over the winter. But it's okay to leave it in place, and then we'll place the tulips in here, and then we'll fill this with compost, and our irrigation will actually be down right at the roots of the tulips. So I get asked a lot about the compost that's left in this tulip bed. It seems like such an expense to haul in so much compost to put into these beds for the tulip production. And so I want to just go over my thought process about the compost for tulips, for my no-till tulip system. For starters, yes, it is an expense up front, but what happens is I don't consider it part of the cost of production for tulips, because this is going to be really enriched compost by the springtime that we can use on all of our beds throughout the farm. So basically, this is almost like compost being let to age over the winter with a bunch of living roots from tulip bulbs in it. So there's tons of microbiology happening in the compost while the tulips are growing in this bed system. And just generally speaking, the compost is aging over the winter, continuing to break down. There's lots and lots of worms when we dig into it in the spring. So it's fantastic stuff by the springtime. So essentially we take these boards off once we've harvested all the tulips out of it, because we pull our tulips up. We pull the tulips up by the bulb. We don't cut our tulips off, but we pull it up by the bulb, so the whole thing, the whole plant comes out of the compost. And so what's left is just compost at the very end of this. Once the tulips are all done for the season, it's just compost. So with that in mind, you take the sides off the bed and you just come in with shovels and you fill up a wheelbarrow with compost and you haul it around to the rest of the farm wherever it needs to go. So this is the compost that we use when we're bed prepping other crops in the spring. And then by the end, this will be all dug out except for a thin layer. We do leave a thin layer of compost on this bed in the springtime when the tulips are done. And then we plant this bed with whatever the next crop is. I'm trying to remember. A lot of times it ends up being like zinnias or something like that, because the tulips finish up in mid-May usually, so it's like a perfect time to put in summer crops right after that into a bed that is teeming with life and soil that is completely undisturbed and generally has lots of mycelium and worms and everything else running through it. So don't think about the compost as this big expense that you're adding to your tulip production. In reality, your tulips are doing work for you over the winter time by keeping the compost healthy and active and buzzing with life, so you'll have basically an inoculated, enriched compost in the springtime to use in the rest of your farm. Hi, I'm talking. All right, so once the tulips arrive from the supplier, so we're usually getting tulips in from big wholesale orders where we're ordering thousands of tulip bulbs at a time. They come in crates. We'll get our crates here, and then we're going to take the bulbs that are from the crates and put them into the bed, and we plant them in what we call egg carton style, which means that we place the bulbs really close to each other so they look exactly the way eggs would look in a carton. So they're almost touching. There's usually about like a 1/4 inch of space between each bulb. So we can really load up this bed with tons of bulbs. It's amazing. We can get like 10,000 tulips in about 100 square feet of bed space, or not 100 square, 100 linear bed space. And so you don't need a lot of space to plant a lot of tulips. So once they're in there in egg carton style, they're just laid directly on the ground. I don't have any tulips with me at the moment, but we'll show you this in a little bit. So we'll put them in, we'll snuggle them into the ground, egg carton style. And then once they're all laid out, we get compost, and we scatter initially a very thin layer of compost on because we want to settle the bulbs in. We don't want to end up tipping the bulbs over. Tulip bulbs really need to be in with the point facing up, so they kind of look like Hershey Kisses, frankly. And so we will initially put just a thin layer of compost on so they don't get dislodged. And then once they're pretty settled, then we just come in and honestly, we just dump we'll have a wheelbarrow full of compost, and we just pull it over and literally dump it on at that point. So it gets to be really, really fast. We can usually plant about 10,000 tulips in a day with a hardworking crew. So it's a really quick process overall. And then once the compost is in, we rake it nice and smooth, so it's a nice smooth bed surface. And after that, we layer on a thin layer, not too thick, but a thin layer of straw. And the straw is just there to help the compost stay moist throughout the winter. It adds a little bit of insulation, but not too much insulation. And it also helps the biology continue to churn. You know, it's just that little blanket for all the biology in the compost. And then in the spring, when it's time for the tulips to bloom, I just rake the straw off the top, because it'll get in the way if you leave it on while the tulips are pushing up through. But it definitely just helps to protect the surface a little bit, especially now we're growing in compost, so we don't have this issue. But if you were growing in the ground in the old trench style that so many growers have done in the past, the soil surface will crust heavily over the winter time if you don't protect it in some way. So the soil surface will just be, you know, it's like fallow ground basically. You need to put straw. If you are doing the old trench method where you dig down into the soil, you definitely need to put straw on top to just protect that soil surface, to give it a blanket. And that's pretty much it. It's such a quick and easy process. I used to plant tulips in the old trench style where you have to dig down 6 to 8 inches in the soil. It's a tremendous amount of soil disturbance. It's also really hard on your back. It would take hours and hours and hours with a shovel and just keep shoveling, and you hate it. And it would take days to dig the trench, and then it would, you know, you'd have to do all the process of planting them and covering it back up. So you'd also have to dig and shovel all that soil back onto the bed. So it was much more time consuming, much more back-breaking labor. This process has sped it up tremendously, and in the spring you end up with a very high quality product, because the bulb has been growing in moist compost all winter long, and that keeps it nice and just at the right temperature and the right moisture, so you get a really nice long stem, a better quality stem than you would planting into the soil. And it's much easier to harvest the bulbs out of compost than it is out of compacted, crusted soil. So there's a lot of benefits. I go into full detail, very ad nauseum detail about this process in my blog. I have a blog at loveandfreshflowers.com. You can look up the blog, and then in the blog search for no-till tulips, and you'll get the full breakdown of exactly how I do this step by step. Also, there is a fantastic tulip episode on no-till flowers that I did with Dave Dowling, who is a tulip expert, and we talked in detail as well there about this process and why you should be growing tulips at your farm and which tulips to grow. Lots and lots of details about tulips. That's on the No-Till Flowers podcast, and look for the episode with Dave Dowling, the tulip, all things tulip episode. And yeah, I hope you guys grow lots of tulips, because they're a fantastic crop for small flower farms.